Welcome to Maple Drive. Linda loved her new home on Maple Drive. The street was pristine, lined with houses that looked identical. Each had a manicured lawn and a bright red door. It was the picture of suburban perfection, and Linda, new to the neighborhood, was eager to fit in. She spent her days unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, excited to make the house her own. One evening, while unpacking kitchen boxes, Linda glanced out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Her gaze drifted to the house directly across from hers. It was identical to all the others, yet something felt off. The curtains were drawn, and an unsettling stillness hung over the house. Linda shook off the strange feeling and went back to unpacking. As the days passed, however, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she looked out the window, she felt an eerie presence emanating from the empty house. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just the stress of moving. But deep down, a seed of unease began to grow. One cool evening, as Linda prepared dinner, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned towards the window and froze. A figure stood in the window across the street, obscured by the sheer curtains. Linda's breath caught in her throat. The figure appeared tall and slender, its features indistinguishable in the fading light. Linda stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure remained motionless, its silhouette a dark outline against the faint glow emanating from inside the house. Linda couldn't tear her eyes away, her mind racing with questions. Who was it? Why were they standing there in the dark? As Linda stared, the figure moved slightly, raising its hand as if adjusting the curtain. A glint of light flashed from its finger, like the reflection of metal. Linda's blood ran cold. It was a ring, a large ornate ring that glinted ominously in the dim light. Fear coiled in Linda's stomach. She knew she should look away, but she couldn't break eye contact with the figure. It was as if an invisible force held her captive. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, its presence both menacing and strangely alluring. Suddenly, as if sensing her gaze, the figure moved again. It stepped closer to the window, and Linda could have sworn she saw the faint outline of a face, pale and gaunt, staring back at her. Linda gasped and stumbled backward, her heart racing. She had to get out of there. Linda backed away from the window, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. She stumbled over a box, the sound seeming deafening in the sudden silence. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She raced to the front door, fumbled with the lock, and bolted outside. The cool night air hit her like a slap. She stood on her porch, her chest heaving, and looked back at the house across the street. The curtains were drawn, and the house was dark and silent once more. Had she imagined it all? Was the stress of the move finally getting to her? Linda shook her head. She knew what she had seen. The figure, the ring, the face in the window. It was all too real. A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, observing her every move. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Linda decided to talk to her neighbors. Surely someone must have seen something, knew something about the strange occurrences across the street. She started with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman next door, known for her gossip and her watchful eye on the neighborhood. But Mrs. Henderson, to Linda's surprise, claimed to have seen nothing out of the ordinary. Days turned into nights, and the unsettling feeling of being watched intensified. Linda's sleep was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and piercing gazes. She started seeing the figure everywhere, in the reflection of her phone screen, in the shadows cast by passing cars, even in the flickering flames of her fireplace. One evening, as Linda sat alone in her living room, her nerves on edge, she saw it again. The figure stood in the window across the street, its silhouette stark against the light streaming from inside the house. This time, however, the curtains were partially drawn back, and Linda could see the figure's face clearly. It was a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, ringed with shadows. Her lips were stretched into a thin, unsettling smile, and her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like a funeral shroud. She wore a long, flowing white dress that seemed to glow in the dim light. Linda's breath caught in her throat. The woman's eyes were fixed on her, boring into her soul. Terror gripped Linda's heart. She felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak as the woman's gaze held her captive. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, like that of a predator. Linda stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran to the phone and dialed 911, but as she went to explain what she had seen, the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she articulate the sheer terror that gripped her soul? Frustrated and terrified, Linda hung up the phone. She knew she had to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid of her own shadow. She had to find out who this woman was and what she wanted. The next day, Linda decided to investigate the house across the street. She had never seen anyone enter or leave the house, and the curtains were always drawn. It was as if the house itself was shrouded in secrecy. Armed with nothing but her determination and a growing sense of dread, Linda crossed the street and approached the house. As she got closer, Linda noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. A cold breeze whispered through the opening, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something unidentifiable yet distinctly unsettling. Linda hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What was she doing? This was crazy. But something, perhaps a morbid curiosity or a desperate need for answers, compelled her forward. Linda pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Cobwebs clung to the walls, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. It was clear that the house had been abandoned for quite some time. As Linda stepped inside, her footsteps echoed through the eerie silence. She called out, her voice trembling slightly, "Hello, is anyone here?" Only silence greeted her in return. Linda cautiously made her way through the house, her senses on high alert. She passed through the living room, where furniture sat draped in dusty sheets, and into the dining room, where a lone chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. The house was a time capsule, frozen in a state of perpetual decay. Yet despite its dilapidated state, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been living here, watching her, waiting for this very moment. Linda reached the foot of the stairs and paused. The steps creaked ominously under her weight. She took a deep breath and began to climb, her hand trailing along the dusty banister. The air grew colder as she ascended, sending a shiver down her spine. What was she hoping to find up there? What awaited her at the top of the stairs? Linda reached the top of the stairs and found herself facing a long, dark hallway. Doors lined either side, each one closed, concealing the secrets within. Linda hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her fear threatening to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, determined to see this through to the end. One by one, Linda checked the rooms. Each one was empty, filled with the same musty air and oppressive silence as the rest of the house. Dust-covered furniture sat untouched, as if frozen in time. Linda found no signs of life, no indication that anyone had been living in the house, let alone the woman she had seen in the window. As Linda entered the last room at the end of the hall, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The room was different. Unlike the others, it wasn't filled with dusty furniture and cobwebs. This room was empty, save for a single, solitary object in the center of the room. A full-length mirror stood in the middle of the room, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness. Linda approached the mirror cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't her own. Linda's reflection in the mirror was distorted, twisted into a grotesque mockery of her own form. Her eyes were wide and staring, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. And behind her, lurking in the shadows, stood the woman from the window. Her pale, gaunt face was contorted in a malevolent grin, and her eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Linda stumbled back from the mirror, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. She turned to run, but the woman was suddenly there, standing in the doorway, blocking her escape. Her long white dress flowed around her like liquid shadows, and her eyes seemed to burn into Linda's soul. "You shouldn't be here," the woman hissed, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to claw at Linda's sanity. "This house, it's not safe." Linda's mind raced. Who was this woman? What did she want? And what was the secret of this house? The woman took a step closer, and Linda could feel the air grow colder, heavier. "You've seen too much," the woman whispered, her eyes boring into Linda's. "Now you must join me. Forever." Linda's breath caught in her throat. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was in mortal danger. Linda's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of the nightmare unfolding before her. She had to think fast. The woman was closing in, her presence suffocating, her eyes like two black holes threatening to suck Linda into their depths. "Who are you?" Linda choked out, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I am the guardian of this house," she hissed, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "I protect its secrets and punish those who dare to uncover them." Panic surged through Linda. "But this is my house," she cried. "I just moved in." The woman's smile widened, becoming even more menacing. "This house, it doesn't belong to you," she said. "It belongs to the shadows, to the darkness, to me." Linda's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for a weapon, an escape, anything. But there was nothing. She was trapped, alone with this creature, in this house that seemed to pulse with a dark and ancient energy. As the woman advanced, Linda backed away until she was pressed against the cold, damp wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the house. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of dread. "There's nowhere left to run," the woman hissed, her breath hot on Linda's face. Her eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, held Linda captive, reflecting the terror that consumed her. Linda closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Linda slowly opened her eyes. The woman was gone. The room was empty, silent, except for the sound of Linda's ragged breathing. She was alone. Had she imagined the whole thing? Was she losing her mind? Cautiously, Linda made her way downstairs and out of the house. The sunlight felt warm on her skin, a stark contrast to the chilling cold that had permeated the house. She glanced back at the house, its windows dark and empty. The curtains were drawn, as if the house itself was watching her, daring her to return. Linda never went back to the house across the street. The experience left her shaken, haunted by the memory of the woman and the unsettling feeling that she was still being watched. She tried to put the experience behind her, to convince herself that it had all been a figment of her imagination, a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. The house held a dark secret, a malevolent presence that lingered long after Linda had fled. And sometimes late at night, when the shadows grew long and the wind whispered through the trees, Linda could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the window across the street, its pale, gaunt face illuminated by an eerie, otherworldly light. And in her heart, Linda knew that she would never truly escape the watchful gaze of the house on Maple Drive. She was forever bound to it, a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in a suburban nightmare from which there was no escape.